All right, so let's look at what is Docker Compose and how does it work. Typically, when you want to run your containers, you would use Docker run commands. Now, Docker run comes with many options. We're just using a few options here, mainly the -idt option, that's to begin with. Then next is the name. So I'm putting this command on multiple lines. This is the end of line, the line separator, so that it continues a new line separator, so it continues the command on the next line using this way. And you can use multiple options. For example, I have this -idt, provide a name called as app, provide the port mapping, the host port 80 pointing to the containers port 80, and then provide a couple of environment variables here. Environment variables can be provided using the variable and the value. And finally, the image part. Now, this is again also a very simple version of a Docker run command. Docker run command can be more sophisticated with many different options like log options, resources, and whatnot, so on. And instead of using this as an imperative approach, what you could do, and this is what Docker Compose is, Docker Compose allows you to convert this command into a declarative code using a file such as dockercompose.yaml. You can also use YML instead of YAML. And it's gonna look like this. So basically you take exactly all these options and then convert it into a YAML spec. How do you do that? It looks like this essentially. So you provide the version of the Docker Compose and then you add services. So Docker Compose is a composition of services. Even though we are talking about just one container, it can be many. And this is where you write, let's say the name of the container is app. So the name of the service is app. That's what you begin with. This is what translates into here. And then you provide the image. You start writing the specs for this container. What does it need? It needs an image. So image goes here. The ports, the port mapping, whatever you define using -p option goes like this. And then it allows you to define multiple ports. So this is a list item. And then you provide the environment variables. Again, we have two environment variables, so you can actually see how the list works and here. So environment is the spec, and then we provide multiple environment variables with their values. And this is how it's going to look like. This is why you need those hyphens, and this is the YAML spec. And essentially, if you look at this, this is -idt is implicit here. So you get exactly, you can convert this imperative code to a declarative one using dockercompose.yaml. And once you define it as a code, your life becomes simpler because you can just then put it in one command and it just runs it. And not only that, we can have multiple applications. I just showed you an example of the one application here converted into YAML code. Similarly, let's say I may have another application. I'll keep it even more simpler. So here I just have the image, and the name for the application is defined as app2 instead of app. And then I'm gonna also launch a database. So let's say a 3-tier application here. So there is app1, the first application, the second one here, and both of these applications connect to a backend database. So I would also need to run a database. Now, instead of remembering all of these run commands and running them in an imperative way, using a manual process, that is, you can convert all of this, put the specification of all of this into a YAML spec. That is your Docker Compose file. So now my Docker Compose file looks like this. Again, I have a very simple version. This can look much more sophisticated. I just want to demonstrate the use of Dockerfile here. And if you look at this, exactly the same, right? So the name goes here, the port mapping is here, and I've explained to you how that gets converted into a YAML spec. So Docker Compose, if you want to look at it at Docker Compose, you can actually think of it as your Docker run commands converted into YAML, and that is done for multiple services, because typically you run microservices application stacks. So even if it is a monolith application, you would typically have a database, at least a 2-tier application. So you take all of those services and then convert it into a declarative code, so that then you can feed it to one single command, that is Docker Compose up-d. That's what you typically run. And then that command will read the YAML spec and then convert it into the actual infrastructure on one single node. So Docker Compose is limited to one node, but it will actually automate the process of launching all these containers then. And then since this is a code, you can store it along with your source, and then you can share it with others, and they can create the dev environments very, very quickly. And that is the use of Docker Compose. That's what you use Docker Compose for, to automate your dev environments. You can also use it to create automated test environments and so on. And instead of using Docker run instructions, the code is then shared, stored along with your source, and that is used to launch the application. Since this is automated, this will also be error free, because you don't have to remember then in each of these options. You just codify it once, and then you just launch it as many times as you want. And not only can you launch your stack rapidly, you can also tear it down equally easily. So you can, instead of Docker Compose up, you can just say Docker Compose down, and the entire stack is cleaned up, it goes away. And this is why you would use Docker Compose, to automate your launch process and do that for multiple applications. And not only you get to automate the launch of these services, you also get service discovery. So when the application wants to connect to the database, you also have the service discovery, a DNS based service discovery in place. So you don't have to worry about discovering the IP address of this and manually configuring in the application. It will just connect to that backend service using a name, which makes things very, very simple. And that's Docker Compose for you.